They called him just a guard. 5 minutes later, the most powerful man in the city would be bowing to him. Joon-Seo stood silently at the edge of the corporate chaos, his hands clasped behind his back, the blue fabric of his security uniform sharp against the glass walls of the high-rise. Around the cluttered mahogany desk, executives shouted into phones and argued over liquidation plans as red graphs bled across their laptops. Millions of dollars were evaporating by the second, and to the panicked board members, the guard in the corner was nothing more than part of the furniture. Hello, fam. Welcome to Afro Underworld Mafia Stories. Subscribe now and join us on this unforgettable journey. Don't forget to also comment below where you're watching from. Now let's proceed with the story. No one noticed him, except the man standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows. Park Do-shik, the legendary figure whose name was spoken only in whispers, hadn't uttered a single word since he arrived. He hadn't even looked at the CEO's frantic presentation. But when his heavy, commanding gaze finally lifted and locked onto Joon-Seo's emotionless face, the frantic shouting in the room seemed to die in the air. That was the moment the CEO's world began to collapse. The morning sun glinted off the glass facade of Kang-Hee Tech, but for Joon-Seo, the light was merely a tactical variable. He stood at the main gate, his posture a perfect vertical line, hands clasped precisely behind his back. His blue security uniform was pressed so sharply it looked like armor. To the hundreds of employees streaming past, however, he wasn't a man. He was an obstacle, a human turnstile to be bypassed without a glance. "Move it, blue suit. Some of us actually have meetings that matter," a junior analyst barked, shoving past Joon-Seo and nearly knocking his clipboard to the pavement. Joon-Seo didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, emotionless and focused. He had learned long ago that when you wear a uniform of service, you become a ghost in the eyes of the ambitious. He watched the flow of corporate hierarchy with the detached precision of a predator. He saw the senior partners stepping out of black sedans, their noses upturned as if the very air the help breathed was beneath them. He saw the way they looked through him, their gazes sliding off his face as if it were blank glass. To them, he was part of the infrastructure, no different from the automated gates or the industrial air conditioners humming in the basement. "Hey you," a frantic executive assistant scurried toward him, thrusting a stack of heavy, leather-bound folders into his arms. "Take these to the 47th floor mailroom. Now, I don't have time to wait for the courier." Joon-Seo looked at the folders, then at the woman. "I am assigned to the perimeter security detail, ma'am. I cannot leave my post." She rolled her eyes, a look of pure, unadulterated condescension crossing her face. "It's a security uniform, not a crown. Do your job and be useful for once. Or would you prefer I tell CEO Kang that the help is being difficult today?" Joon-Seo took a slow, measured breath. He felt the weight of the files, but more than that, he felt the heavy silence of his own hidden history. If these people knew the names in his private phone book, they would be trembling. If they knew the debt of blood that the city's most feared men owed his lineage, they would be bowing. But Joon-Seo simply lowered his head slightly, accepting the task with the same quiet authority he applied to everything. As he walked through the lobby, he heard the whispers of the elite. They talked about million-dollar bonuses and international mergers as if the world belonged to them, never noticing the man in blue observing every movement, every flaw, and every arrogant mistake. They treated him like furniture, never realizing that the most dangerous thing in any room is the man who listens while everyone else is screaming to be heard. The atmosphere on the 47th floor was no longer just charged, it was suffocating. As Joon-Seo stepped off the service elevator, the sheer weight of the corporate panic hit him like a physical wall. This was the heart of Kang-Hee Tech, a place that usually hummed with the quiet arrogance of success, but today it sounded like a sinking ship. Executives were huddled in tight circles, their voices hushed and jagged with fear. On the massive digital display in the main corridor, the company's stock ticker was a waterfall of crimson, each flicker representing millions of dollars in net worth simply vanishing into the ether. At the center of the vortex stood Kang Min-Jae. The CEO's expensive silk tie was loosened, his hair, usually styled to perfection, was disheveled and sweat beaded on his upper lip. He was packing a narrow strip of carpet in front of the boardroom, a phone pressed so hard against his ear that his knuckles were white. "I don't care about the market sentiment," he hissed into the receiver. "If the Park Syndicate doesn't sign today, we don't just lose the quarter, we lose the keys to the building. Do you understand? Everything I've built is 120 seconds from being liquidated." He hung up without waiting for an answer, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. He looked past the vice presidents and the legal consultants, his gaze momentarily landing on Joon-Seo, who was quietly delivering the requested folders to the reception desk. For a split second, the CEO's desperation turned into raw, misplaced vitriol. To Min-Jae, seeing someone so calm and lowly in the middle of his empire's collapse was an insult. He needed someone to blame for the silence of his falling fortunes, and the guard was an easy target. But before he could speak, the lobby's heavy double doors swung open. The silence that followed was instantaneous and absolute. The frantic typing stopped. The whispering died. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to retreat. A group of men in charcoal gray suits entered with a synchronized, heavy tread that echoed against the marble. At the lead was Park Do-shik. He didn't look like a man arriving for a business meeting. He looked like a sovereign arriving to inspect a conquered territory. His presence was heavy, commanding, and utterly dominant, casting a long shadow over the frantic, exposed vulnerability of the CEO. Min-Jae scrambled forward, a forced, trembling smile plastered onto his face. He reached out a hand, his voice cracking with a desperation he couldn't hide. "Chairman Park, we've been expecting you. Everything is ready, I assure you." Park Do-shik didn't take the hand. He didn't even acknowledge the CEO's existence. His eyes were scanning the room with a cold, piercing intelligence, looking for something that had nothing to do with balance sheets or bankruptcy. In that moment, the corporate illusion of Kang-Hee Tech officially met the underworld reality of the man who now held its life in his hands. The heavy glass doors hissed open, and the atmosphere in the lobby shifted from frantic chaos to a chilling, pressurized silence. A fleet of black sedans had come to a halt outside, and from the lead vehicle stepped Park Do-shik. He moved with a heavy, commanding dominance that seemed to swallow the light in the room. His suit was dark and understated, but the sheer gravity of his presence made the high-rise office feel like a house of cards waiting to fall. CEO Kang Min-Jae rushed forward, his face a mask of desperate, oily sweat. He was breathing too fast, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. To any outside observer, it was a display of corporate eagerness, but to Han Joon-Seo, watching from his post, it was a pathetic display of a man who had already lost. "Chairman Park, an honor, a true honor," Min-Jae stammered, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure of the falling red graphs upstairs. In his haste to secure the merger and save his own skin, he bypassed every rule of tradition that men like Do-shik lived by. Min-Jae reached out, grabbing the older man's elbow to usher him toward the elevators, a gesture of forced intimacy that was an unforgivable breach of old guard protocol. "We have the documents ready, sir. If we could just move to the boardroom immediately, time is of the essence." The air in the lobby didn't just turn cold, it froze. Park Do-shik stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't pull away, he simply became a mountain that refused to move. The Mafia Boss's eyes lowered, not in fear, but in a lethal brand of disappointment. In the world of high-stakes honor, to touch a superior without permission, to rush a guest of his stature, and to ignore the formal greeting was not just a mistake, it was a blood insult. The executives behind the CEO turned pale, realizing the gravity of the blunder. Min-Jae, blinded by his own arrogance and the looming bankruptcy, didn't let go. He tugged slightly, trying to force the king of the underworld into a corporate box. "Chairman, the elevators are this way." Do-shik's jaw tightened. The silent command in his posture was clear. The deal was dead before it had even begun. He began to turn back toward the door, his expression one of stony finality. The $100 million merger was evaporating because the CEO treated a man of honor like a common business lead. From the corner of the room, Joon-Seo watched the collapse. He saw the CEO's vulnerability and the boss's controlled power. He knew that in 10 seconds, the black sedans would leave, and Kang-Hee Tech would cease to exist. It was time for the invisible man to speak the language the elite had forgotten. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a total collapse. At the head of the table, Park Do-shik, the man whose shadow governed the city's unseen world, had gone perfectly still. His cold gaze was fixed on the mahogany surface, his silence a clear indication that the CEO's clumsy, modern greeting had hit a wall of ancient pride. Kang Min-Jae stood frozen, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. He had tried to play the part of a global titan, but in the face of true, old-world authority, his flashy suit and rehearsed English lines felt like cheap theater. "If there is nothing else," Do-shik's assistant began, his voice like sliding ice, "the chairman believes his time is being wasted on those who do not know their place." Min-Jae's mouth worked soundlessly, the red graphs on the screen behind him seemingly mocking his failure. He was about to lose the only lifeline his company had left. That was when the heavy oak door creaked. Joon-Seo stepped out of the shadows by the mail cart, his presence as calm and vertical as a mountain. He didn't look at the panicked CEO. He didn't look at the frantic board members. He walked directly into the center of the room, stopping exactly 3 paces from Park Do-shik. Then he spoke. The words were low, resonant, and carried a rhythmic cadence that made the executives blink in confusion. It wasn't the standard Korean taught in business schools. It was a rare, high-level dialect of honor, a linguistic relic used only by the innermost circles of the traditional elite. Joon-Seo addressed the boss not as an investor, but as a great pillar, using honorifics that acknowledged a history much deeper than a bank balance. He corrected the CEO's subtle insult by offering a formal apology rooted in the philosophy of Inyon, the invisible threads of destiny that bind people together. The room chilled. Park Do-shik's eyes snapped up, locking onto Joon-Seo. For the first time that day, the boss's expression shifted. His mask of indifference cracked, replaced by a look of sharp, intense recognition. The air in the room, previously thick with the CEO's desperation, was now heavy with a different kind of power, the power of a secret shared between 2 men who understood a world the executives couldn't even imagine. Joon-Seo finished his sentence and lowered his head in a measured, dignified bow. He had saved the deal, not with a spreadsheet, but with a voice that proved he belonged to a lineage of honor that outranked every person at that table. The silence in the boardroom was so thick it felt physical. CEO Kang Min-Jae's face had turned a deep, mottled purple, the veins in his neck bulging as he stared at the security guard who had dared to disrupt the most important negotiation of his life. To Min-Jae, this wasn't just an interruption, it was a personal desecration of his kingdom. "What did you just say?" Min-Jae's voice was a low, dangerous hiss that quickly escalated into a roar. "Who do you think you are? You were fired 10 minutes ago. You're a trespassing nobody in a cheap polyester suit." He turned toward the other guards at the door, his arm outstretched, finger trembling with rage. "Get him out of here, drag him out, call the police and have him charged. I want this trash scrubbed from my building immediately." The guards moved forward, their heavy boots thudding against the expensive carpet, but they stopped dead as a single, sharp sound cut through the room. It was the sound of Park Do-shik's hand hitting the mahogany table. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a gavel. The Mafia Boss, who had been a statue of cold indifference just moments before, was now standing. His eyes, usually as unreadable as black stone, were wide, locked onto Joon-Seo with an intensity that made the air feel thin. "Wait," Do-shik commanded. The single word carried so much authority that the guards retreated instinctively. Min-Jae blinked, his mouth hanging open, the scream dying in his throat. "Chairman Park, I am so sorry for this mental breakdown by the help. We'll have him removed and continue with the—" "Quiet," Do-shik snapped, never taking his eyes off Joon-Seo. He stepped around the table, ignoring the CEO as if he were a buzzing fly. He walked until he was inches from the guard, searching Joon-Seo's face, tracing the line of his jaw and the steady, unshaken depth of his eyes. The room held its breath. The red graphs on the screens continued to bleed value, but no one was looking at them anymore. Do-shik's voice was barely a whisper now, cracked with a rare, raw emotion. "Those eyes, that stance, I haven't seen that look in 30 years. Joon-Seo didn't move. He didn't bow. He simply met the boss's gaze with a calm, quiet dignity that seemed to outrank every suit in the room. "Who are you?" Dushik asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and sudden, piercing hope. "Tell me your father's name, right now." Min-Jae scrambled forward, desperate to regain control. "Chairman, please, he's just a gate guard, he's nobody." But Dushik didn't hear him. He was staring at the ghost of a hero, waiting for the words that would destroy the CEO's world. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against the glass walls of the boardroom like a physical weight. CEO Kang Min-Jae stood frozen, his finger still leveled at the door, his chest heaving with the remnants of his indignant rage. He expected the security team to swarm in and drag Joon-Seo out. He expected Park Dushik to nod in approval at the removal of such low-level insolence. Instead, the atmosphere in the room shifted with terrifying speed. Park Dushik didn't look at the CEO. He didn't look at the trembling legal counsel or the scattered papers on the mahogany table. His eyes were locked onto Han Joon-Seo, and for the first time that day, the legendary Mafia Boss looked truly shaken. The cold, impenetrable mask of the Underworld king cracked, replaced by a look of profound, almost spiritual recognition. Slowly, deliberately, Dushik stepped away from the window. The polished heels of his shoes clicked rhythmically against the floor, the only sound in the vacuum of the room. He stopped exactly 3 paces in front of the man in the blue security uniform. Then the impossible happened. Park Dushik, the man who held the city's debt in his pocket, the man who never lowered his head to politicians or rival kings, placed his hands at his sides. He shifted his weight, and with a slow, agonizingly respectful grace, he bent his body at the waist. He didn't stop at a polite nod. He continued down until his back was a perfect horizontal line, performing a deep, formal 90-degree bow. The CEO's jaw literally dropped. He looked like a man watching the laws of gravity fail in real time. The executives behind him gasped, one of them dropping a tablet that clattered uselessly to the floor. They were witnessing a god of the underworld pay homage to a man they had treated like a ghost. "I did not think I would live to see this day," Dushik's voice rasped, muffled by the floor as he held the bow. "To find the bloodline of the great silent one in a place like this, in a suit that is beneath your name." Joon-Seo remained as still as a statue, his expressionless gaze softening just a fraction, the only sign that he acknowledged the weight of the gesture. He didn't gloat. He didn't look at the CEO. He simply stood in his quiet authority, a king in a guard's skin. "Lord Park," Joon-Seo said softly, his voice carrying a resonance that made the CEO's previous shouting seem like the whimpering of a child. "You may rise. My father's debt was settled long ago." "A debt of life is never settled," Dushik replied, finally straightening up. He turned his head slowly toward Kang Min-Jae, his eyes turning back into chips of ice. The CEO flinched as if he had been struck. "You told me this man was trash, Min-Jae. You told me he was a nobody." The power in the room had not just shifted, it had been utterly rebuilt. The boardroom, usually a theater of cold calculations, fell into a silence so absolute it felt heavy. CEO Kang Min-Jae stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, looking between the security guard he had just discarded and the underworld king who had just humbled himself. The air, which had been frantic with the smell of expensive coffee and desperate sweat, now carried the weight of history. Park Dushik remained in his bow for a fraction longer than necessary, a deliberate choice to show the room exactly where the true power sat. When he finally straightened, his eyes were not on the CEO, but locked onto Han Joon-Seo with a fierce, burning recognition. "I have spent 3 decades looking for the son of the silent guard," Dushik began, his voice dropping into a low, resonant rumble that commanded every ear. 30 years ago, in the winter of 1996, my family was cornered in the back streets of Busan. We were betrayed by our own, surrounded by men who meant to leave no survivors. I was young, arrogant, and certain that was my final night." The Mafia Boss stepped closer to Joon-Seo, ignoring the executives who scrambled back like startled birds. "A single man stood between my life and the blades of 20 killers. He didn't wear a tailored suit or chairman's title. He wore a simple watchman's jacket. He didn't speak a word. He simply stood his ground until the sun rose and my reinforcements arrived. He saved my lineage, then disappeared into the fog of the city, refusing even a single one as a reward. Dushik reached out, his hand, scarred from decades of survival, resting firmly on Joon-Seo's shoulder. He turned his head slightly toward the trembling CEO, his gaze turning into shards of ice. Your security records called that man Han Tae-sung, but to me, he was the only man I ever feared, because he was the only man I could never buy. He looked back at Joon-Seo, his expression softening into a rare, grim respect. I see his eyes in yours, Joon-Seo, the same stillness, the same refusal to be broken by those who think their bank accounts make them kings. Joon-Seo didn't move, his upright posture unshaken, though a flicker of emotion finally touched his focused eyes. The trash that Min-Jae had kicked across the floor was now revealed to be a relic of a hero. Mr. Kang, the boss said, not even glancing at the CEO, you told this man he was a nobody. You told him he would always be a nobody. But in my world, he is the only person in this building whose word is worth more than your entire company's stock. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The debt of honor was a currency the corporate world didn't understand, and the CEO had just gone bankrupt in a way no lawyer could fix. The silence in the boardroom was no longer the heavy, respectful quiet of a ritual. It had curdled into a cold, suffocating vacuum. CEO Kang Min-Jae remained frozen, his hand still awkwardly extended toward the leather-bound folder on the desk, his fingers trembling. He looked from the bowed head of the legendary Park Dushik to the stone-faced security guard he had just tried to erase. The realization was a slow, agonizing poison. He hadn't just fired a guard, he had insulted a king's bloodline. Park Dushik straightened his back, his presence expanding until he seemed to dwarf everyone in the room. He didn't look at the CEO, he didn't look at the frantic legal team or the red graphs still bleeding out across the monitors. His eyes were fixed solely on Han Joon-Seo, filled with a look of profound, ancient debt. Mr. Park, Min-Jae stammered, his voice thin and cracking. There has clearly been a misunderstanding. This man, he's just a new hire, a lapse in protocol. If you'll just look at the merger terms, we've adjusted the equity in your favor. The Mafia Boss held up a single, gloved hand. The motion was small, but it cut the CEO's words off like a blade. Dushik turned his gaze toward Min-Jae, and for the first time, the coldness in his eyes turned into a searing, visible contempt. You speak of equity, Dushik said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated in the floorboards. You speak of terms and percentages, but you do not know the value of the ground you stand on. You saw a blue uniform and thought you saw a servant. I saw the eyes of the man who carried my wounded brother through a hail of gunfire while the world watched us burn. He stepped toward the desk, but instead of reaching for the pen, he closed the contract folder with a definitive thud. The sound echoed like a gavel. My family does not build bridges with those who spit on honor, the boss continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I do not sign contracts with those who insult my family's blood. To insult the son of Han is to insult the House of Park. The CEO's face went from pale to a sickly, ashen gray. Please, the company will go under by morning. Park Dushik ignored the plea, turning back to Joon-Seo. A small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of the boss's mouth, a look of two equals standing amidst wreckage. He reached into his coat, pulled out a gold fountain pen, and placed it on the table, sliding it across the polished wood until it tapped against Joon-Seo's hand. I will save this firm on one condition, Dushik declared, loud enough for every panicked executive in the hallway to hear. I do not sign with a man who leads with fear. I only sign with Joon-Seo. From this moment, he is the voice of this deal. If he walks, I walk. Joon-Seo looked down at the pen, then up at the broken man in the gray suit. The invisible guard finally spoke, his voice calm and unshaken. Pick up my badge, Mr. Kang. We have work to do. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open, but this time, the rhythmic click of leather shoes on marble replaced the heavy thud of a guard's boots. Han Joon-Seo walked into the room wearing a tailored charcoal suit that fit him with the same precision as his old uniform, yet the air around him had shifted. He was no longer a ghost to be ignored. He was the center of the corporate universe. Behind him, Park Du-shik walked with the measured pace of a shadow king, his presence ensuring that the silence in the room remained absolute. Kang Min-Jae sat slumped at the far end of the table, his grey suit rumpled and his face a mask of pale disbelief. The red graphs on the screen behind him still bled downward, but the frantic shouting had been replaced by a suffocating tension. The power in the room had physically migrated to the other end of the table, where a single leather chair waited for the man who had been fired only hours ago. Joon-Seo sat down, his movements calm and economical. He didn't look at the panic-stricken board members or the lawyers who were suddenly eager to offer him coffee. His focus was on the two documents resting on the mahogany surface, the billion-dollar merger agreement and the formal report on executive conduct. The merger, Park Du-shik's voice rumbled, breaking the silence like a gavel, is now entirely dependent on the oversight director's approval. My investment follows Joon-Seo. Where he leads, my capital flows. Joon-Seo picked up a fountain pen, the nib hovering over the merger papers. But before he signed, he slid the second document across the table toward Kang Min-Jae. The CEO's hands trembled as he took it. It was a comprehensive review of the firm's leadership, specifically a detailed account of the toxic environment and professional negligence exhibited by the CEO himself. Character is the only true currency of a leader, Joon-Seo said, his voice quiet but echoing in the hushed room. You believed that a uniform made a man invisible. You believed that arrogance was a substitute for honor. You were wrong. Min-Jae looked up, his mouth opening as if to protest, but the words died in his throat as he met Joon-Seo's steady, unshaken gaze. The CEO realized with a jolt of terror that his career wasn't just ending, it was being erased by the very man he had called trash. With a smooth, decisive stroke, Joon-Seo signed the merger, securing the company's future and billions in funding. Then, without a hint of malice, he signed the second paper, the one that stripped Kang Min-Jae of his titles and directed him to vacate the premises immediately. The tables hadn't just turned, they had been completely rebuilt. As security, men who now stood a little straighter under Joon-Seo's leadership entered to escort the former CEO out. Joon-Seo simply adjusted his cuffs and looked toward the city at dusk, ready to build something that finally mattered. Exactly 1 year had passed since the marble floor of the lobby had echoed with the sound of a falling badge and the shallow breaths of a humiliated CEO. Today, the air in the headquarters of Kang-Hee Tech was still charged, but the electricity was no longer fueled by panic. It was fueled by purpose. Han Joon-Seo stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite, the city at dusk sprawling beneath him like a sea of amber lights. He no longer wore the stiff polyester of a gate guard. His suit was charcoal wool, tailored with the same precision he had once applied to his security rounds. Yet his posture remained identical, upright, unshaken, and calm. The boardroom behind him, once a place where red graphs signaled the end of a legacy, was now vibrant with growth. Under Joon-Seo's leadership as the special board trustee, the company hadn't just survived, it had evolved. He had dismantled the rigid walls of corporate elitism, replacing them with a culture of respect that became the talk of the industry. He had implemented a policy where every voice, from the janitorial staff to the senior engineers, was heard. He knew better than anyone that the most valuable insights often came from those who were treated as invisible. A soft chime signaled an arrival. The doors opened and Park Du-shik walked in. The Mafia Boss didn't carry the weight of a negotiator today. He carried the warmth of a brother. He walked straight to Joon-Seo and gripped his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the man Joon-Seo's father had raised him to be. The numbers are unprecedented, Du-shik noted, nodding toward the screens now glowing with steady, green upward trends. But it's the spirit of this place that's changed. People no longer look down when they walk through the lobby. Joon-Seo looked back at the large, framed security badge hanging on his office wall, the same one Kang Min-Jae had once thrown in the trash. It served as a permanent reminder to every executive who entered the room. My father taught me that a person's value isn't woven into their uniform or printed on a diploma, Joon-Seo said, his voice a steady hum of authority. It's built in the way they stand when no one is watching, and the way they treat those who can do nothing for them. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Joon-Seo watched the night shift guards begin their patrol at the gates below. He made it a point to head down every evening to greet them by name. He had proven to the world that a title is just a word, but honor is a legacy. The corporate illusion had finally collapsed, and in its place stood a reality where every person was seen and every soul was respected. The invisible guard had finally made the world open its eyes.